Hey friends, this video is about speciation and how new species are formed. But first, what do you think is the definition of a species? How do you define a species? Why don't you take a minute to jot down your idea, pause the video and unpause when you're ready to continue. It's actually sort of tricky to define a species because there are different species definitions, which we call a species concept. There are two species concepts that you may be aware of. One is the morphological species concept, and the other is the biological species concept. The first species concept, morphological. Morphology refers to appearance or structure. So the morphological species concept means organisms who look the same are of the same species, and organisms that do not look the same are not part of the same species. Well, this works for some instances, but for many instances it does not. We know that there are organisms that are part of the same species but appear to be very different. For example, if the males and females look very different in this group, you might accidentally identify them as different species, even though we know they're part of the same species. The other issue is that there are organisms that look very similar, but when you test their DNA, you realize that they're actually part of different species. The biological species concept is if two individuals can produce fertile, viable offspring together under natural conditions, then they are part of the same species. Now, of course, this doesn't take into consideration that there are always individuals within a group that are infertile and cannot reproduce, but we're talking about the group as a whole. What problems do you see with the biological species concept? Why don't you take some time to think about this, pause the video, unpause when you're ready to discuss. Well, two major problems that I see. One is that the biological species concept assumes sexual reproduction. So you could not apply this definition to asexual organisms. So there are some plants that reproduce asexually. There are bacteria and other unicellular organisms that reproduce asexually. You could not apply this definition. The other thing is you could not apply this definition to organisms that existed in the past. So organisms that are extinct, you could not use the biological species concept because there's no way to test if they could produce fertile and viable offspring. Regardless of which species concept that you use, and there are others in addition to the morphological or biological species concept, there is a common way to denote the species. For example, humans, we're known as Homo sapiens. Well, let's talk through what that means. So let's look at two model organisms, the leopard and a red fox. You can see the species name of the leopard on the left in italics. You can see the species name for the red fox in italics on the right. Now, the species, in terms of classification groups, the species is the most closely related group and, as a consequence, the smallest classification group. The species, similar species are grouped into a genus. So if we look at our leopard, the genus of the leopard is the Panthera. And the Panthera genus includes all of what we call the big cats that can roar. Genuses combine into a family, and family combines into order, order combines into class, class into phylum, the different phyla into kingdoms, and the different kingdoms combine into domains. The higher up the list, the larger the group gets, but the least closely related they are to each other. Going back to the biological species concept, we'll test your understanding over here. As you may know, there's an organism known as the mule, and it is a cross or a hybrid between the horse and the donkey. Now, the horse and the donkey, they are able to mate, or their offspring is a mule. The mule, strong organism, grows, but it is unable to mate. It is infertile or sterile. According to the biological species concept, would you categorize horses and donkeys as the same species? I want you to pause the video, think about it, unpause when you're ready to discuss. And I would say no. According to the biological species concept, the horse and the donkey are not part of the same species because they are, according to the definition, able to produce viable offspring, even under natural conditions, yet those offspring are infertile. So you would say the horse and the donkeys are not similar enough to be considered part of the same species. This brings us to the idea of the evolution of new species. How do new species arise? Speciation is the formation of a new species. There are two types of speciation. One is allopatric speciation, the other is sympatric speciation. So let's tackle allopatric speciation first. Patric refers to country. Allo refers to other. So if you think about what allopatric means, it means other country. So this is speciation that occurs when a geographic barrier shuts down gene flow. Organisms are unable to reproduce with other organisms in a different location because of some geographic barrier, a physical barrier that does not allow them to mate. I want you to think about what are some examples of these geographic barriers. Pause the video to think about it, unpause when you're ready to discuss. And you probably think, depending on the organism, type of organism, a river could shut down gene flow, mountains, lakes that dry up, volcanic eruptions, even climate changes, and loss of land bridges might prevent gene flow. The other type of speciation is sympatric. Remember, patric means country, sim would mean same. So now we're having speciation occurring in the same geographic area. So there isn't a mountain or other barrier that prevents gene flow between these organisms. They're in the same location, but they're still unable to reproduce together. So sympatric speciation means that species originate in the same geographic area, and instead reproductive barriers shut down gene flow. So I want you to think about what are some possible reproductive barriers. What could prevent organisms from mating with each other, even if they're in the same location? I want you to think about this, pause and unpause when you're ready to discuss. So let's say two organisms from different species try to mate. What are some things that would prevent them from mating? Well, one, if they may be in the same geographic area, but what if they're in a different habitat within that geographic area? So if one lives on land, the other lives on water, they will not be able to mate. Let's say they're in the same habitat. So let's say they both live on land. But let's say they mate at different times of the year, or mate, one is nocturnal and the other lives during the daytime. Well, they're in the same geographic area, same habitat, but now they mate at different times of the year or different times of the day. And so now they're unable to mate. But now let's say they are in the same geographic area, within the same habitat, mate at the same time. But what if they're just not attracted to each other? So now let's say they are attracted to each other and they do attempt to mate. So they're in the same geographic area, within the same habitat, they mate at the same time, and they are attracted to each other and they attempt to mate. But what if their reproductive organs don't fit? What if they're not the same size or the same shape or the same structure? Well, they're not going to be able to physically mate with each other. Let's say they are able to physically mate with each other. They live in the same geographic area, within the same habitat, mate at the same time of the year, they are attracted to each other, and they physically can mate with each other. Well, what if there's something that prevents the sperm from fertilizing the egg? Either the sperm is incompatible with the egg, or the sperm dies before it reaches the egg. Those are what we call prezygotic barriers. Zygote is a fertilized egg. So those barriers that prevented the sperm from fertilizing the egg are known as prezygotic barriers. So before the zygote is formed. And let's talk about the names of those examples. If they live in a different habitat within the same geographic area, that's habitat isolation. If they mate at different times of the year or day, temporal isolation. If there's no attraction between them, that is behavioral isolation. If their reproductive organs are physically incompatible, we call that mechanical isolation. And if the sex cells or the gametes are incompatible or unable to fuse, we call that gametic isolation. So those are the 5 prezygotic barriers. But now let's say there is successful fertilization of the egg. So the sperm of organisms from one species fertilizes the egg of the other species. Well, there's still things that can prevent successful mating for generations. So let's say that zygote dies right after fertilization or inside of mom, or there's a miscarriage. Or let's say that organism is born and dies, is very sickly and dies at a young age. All of those are what we call hybrid inviability. So first of all, a hybrid is an organism, is an offspring that arises between two different species. So for example, that mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. So let's say that hybrid dies inside of mom or dies as a young child, anything before reproductive age, we call that hybrid inviability. So the word inviable means that is unsuccessful, it's unable to live. Now let's say that hybrid is viable and it does grow to reproductive age, but it is unable to reproduce. And we call that hybrid sterility because that hybrid is sterile or infertile. And then let's say the hybrid is viable and the hybrid reproduces with another hybrid. And if anything happens to that next generation, so this would be the grandchildren of the two different species, right? So the offspring of the hybrids, if those grandchildren are either inviable or are sterile, then we call that hybrid breakdown. So that's in the generation after the hybrids. Now we call those three hybrid inviability, hybrid sterility, and hybrid breakdown. We call those post-zygotic barriers. And that makes sense because you have a zygote. Anything that goes wrong after the zygote has occurred, then those would be post-zygotic barriers. So we can rethink our biological definition of a species, a biological concept. We can say that organisms are of the same species if there are no reproductive barriers. So if there are no prezygotic barriers and no postzygotic barriers, then we call them the same species. But the presence of any of these barriers, prezygotic and or postzygotic barriers, we would say there are different species.